𝓥𝓲𝓫𝓱𝓪 and welcome to Jai Hind Classes Funda Clear. In this video, I will explain Class 11th Political Science Chapter 10, which is the last chapter of this book. The chapter is The Philosophy of the Constitution. Now in this book, in the last 9 chapters, we have studied about the important and the major provisions of the Indian Constitution and how these have worked in the last 70 plus years of the implementation of the Indian Constitution. We have also seen that how the Indian Constitution has evolved over the many years. But have you ever asked yourself this question, that why the leaders of the national movement decided to choose to bind the future generations and the people of India at that time by a constitution? What was the basic need at the first place for a constitution? In this chapter, we will try to understand the philosophy of the Indian Constitution. Now, by the term philosophy, we mean that the core values of the Constitution, what are the limitations, strengths, achievements and criticisms about the Indian Constitution. In this chapter, we will try to understand many questions about the Indian Constitution, such as why do we need to study the philosophy of the Constitution? Why do we always relate it to the Constituent Assembly? What are the core principles of the Indian Constitution, the criticisms of the Indian Constitution and the limitations of the Indian Constitution? So without any further ado, let's get started with the first topic, which is what is meant by the philosophy of the Constitution. Now, when we say the philosophy of the Constitution, isn't just Constitution about laws? Many people think so. Many people think that Constitution is just about laws and laws are not related to moral values, but that is not true. There are many laws which are related to moral values, ideals and principles of the people. For example, if a law states that people cannot be discriminated on the basis of language or religion, that means that it reflects the idea, the value of equality. That means it is related to a moral value. So we can say that it's very important to study the Constitution by approach of political philosophy. We just do not have to see it from the perspective of legalistic approach. We have to see it from the approach of philosophical view. Now, by saying political philosophical view of the Constitution, what do we mean? There are 3 points that need to be studied. First is that the conceptual structure of the Indian Constitution. By saying conceptual structure, it means that the meaning of terms that are used in the Constitution, such as rights, minorities, democracy, what are the meanings of these terms which are used in the Indian Constitution? Second point is that we need to have a grasp of the set of ideals which are embedded in the Indian Constitution. It means that by understanding those set of ideals, only can we have a very good society, a coherent and legalistic society. Third is that for any political view, for any philosophical view of the Constitution, we need to have justifications. As you know that even in the last chapter we studied that there can be many interpretations of the same provision in the Indian Constitution, and it is justified to have many kind of interpretation by different institutions in the country. You must have seen that in universities, in colleges, in different government bodies, in different organs of the government, same provisions of the Constitution are interpreted in many different ways. It reflects that we are having justification, which is very important for political philosophy of the Constitution. So these 3 points must be studied, must be understood for political philosophy of the Constitution. Now the next thing here is Constitution as a means of democratic transformation. Now, as you know that for any country, the power is bestowed to the government, the power is bestowed to the state. and it is meant for the welfare of the people. But at some point of time it can be misused as well. There can be many people who use that institution, who use different government institutions for misusing their power. The state power can be coercive, can have monopoly. That means that there must be some limitations over the tyranny of the state power, and that is why we need a constitution. As we have already seen in chapter 1 of this book as well, that one of the functions of the constitution is to set limits on the power of the government. Thus there are basic set of rules, there are some limitations on the tyranny of the power of the state. Now another thing is that for having democracy in the country, what is needed? There must be some basic set of norms to have transformation in the society. Like just for example of India, we have seen that the Constitution of India was made by the Constituent Assembly, and Jawaharlal Nehru said that the Constituent Assembly was a nation on a move, not just a political body. It had the right to frame the constitution because it was a nation on the move, which was changing its shell of political structure and social structure, fashioning itself in a new social transformation. It means that one of the basic function or the basic vision of the Constituent Assembly was to have social transformation, and this social transformation was meant as democratic social transformation of the country. As we had already experienced, we already had experience in colonial government, so it was very important to give power. And India's approach, this kind of approach is highly appreciated because not just it limits the power of the state, it limits the power on those people who are having it, but it also gives power to those people who have been traditionally deprived of it, such as minorities, those people who have marginalized from the Indian society. So it gives power to those who had been deprived of it. At the same time, it limits the power who are having much access to it. So this kind of approach leads to democratic transformation in any country, and this can only be possible by means of constitution. So now our next topic here is, why do we need to go back to the Constituent Assembly? Now there must be a question that rises in your mind, is that why we need to go to the past, why need to study about the past to understand the constitution? It should be the work of legal historian who should study about the Constituent Assembly debates. Why should we go back to that era and study about the values and ideas of that time, what the constitution makers thought so? Now if we take the context of American Constitution, that seems to be true because the American Constitution was framed around 18th century. So understanding the values of 18th century in now the 21st century seems absurd. But if we look at the case of Indian Constitution, that may not necessarily be true because the ideals, the values of that time of the Constituent Assembly members and now India's people are not that much different. We have stayed, there has not been so drastic change in our country. The values remain, the ideals remain, and that is why it's important to study about the Constituent Assembly debates to understand the Indian Constitution in a better way. Another way to see it through could be that now in India, we have many practices, many constitutional practices that have been done for a long period of time. And for such a long period of time, they have been continued that we have forgotten the underlying principles and values that are written in the Constitution. Well, as long as the going is good, forgetting the principles is harmless. But what if a question arises on that practice? Then if we do not have any understanding of the underlying principle, it will be harmful. So it means that to understand the reason behind every constitutional organizational practices in our country, the legal practices in our country, we need to study the underlying principles which are embedded in the constitution and the reasons, the ideas, the values behind them, why they were written so. And for doing so, the best way possible is to study the Constituent Assembly debates, or in short, it's known as CAD. Now, next thing here is, what is the political philosophy of our constitution? Now, it is very hard to describe the political philosophy of the Indian Constitution in just one word, because we have many important principles which are important, which are aligning the values and ideals, principles of our country. There are many terms such as liberalism, equality, freedom, we have federalism, egalitarian society. Now, egalitarian society means that the society which believes in equal opportunities for all the people, inequality and equal opportunities to promote among all the people. So there are many brief provisions in the Constitution of India that it's very hard to describe the philosophy of our constitution in just one word. The Constitution of India relates to peaceful democratic transformation of the country as well, to remove the bad practices which are harmful to the society as well. So there are many things which have been written in the Constitution, and that's why it's very important to study all these topics briefly. Now, first note in the political philosophy is the individual freedom. Now, individual freedom refers to those freedom rights that are given to an individual person, and they have not just been given today. They have been long kind of political activities, there have been long political debates and activities even from the colonial era. For example, at the start of the 19th century, Ram Mohan Roy, a very famous, very popular social activist of that time, argued for the freedom of press. He argued that for any state responsive to the needs of the society, it's important to give means to the society so they can tell their needs to the government, to the state government. It means that there should be no curtailment to the freedom of press, as it's a mean by which the people can spread their needs. Another individual freedom could be the freedom from arbitrary arrest. Now, in the case of Rowlatt Act, we saw that it was vehemently opposed by the people of India, by the citizens of India. And that's why in today's time we have the freedom from arbitrary arrest. Even though there have been many rights given to detained people as well, such as to contact a lawyer and to have been shown before the magistrate before 24 hours, within 24 hours. So there have been many freedoms given to an individual person, and we must understand that they have not been given miraculously, but there have been many political activities for those individual freedom. Some of the individual freedoms include freedom of press, freedom of conscience, freedom from arbitrary arrest. So these kind of freedom which are given to an individual freedom, individual person, are categorized under the individual freedom, and it relates to the term of liberalism. If we are giving freedom to an individual person, it means that we are giving liberalism. It means that we are having the value of liberalism. Now, another thing that relates to liberalism is social justice. Though Indian Constitution has adopted liberalism, but it is different from the classical liberalism of the Western philosophies. In Western philosophies, the classical liberalism refers when the individual freedom is higher than the social justice. and in India we have not adopted so. In India we have given more prominence, more importance to the social justice, so that people as a collective, as a community would have better rights. And there are actually two ways. First is that we are having social justice, and a very good example of could be the reservation for SCs and STs. Now, why was reservation given to SCs and STs? Though we had adopted right to equality in the Indian Constitution, but still the Constituent Assembly members thought that the right to equality alone was not enough to protect the rights of the SCs and STs, to give representation to them, and that's why they gave reservation to them. Another is that it provides measures to give rights, to advance, to uplift all those people who had been deprived of rights before. And it could be seen that in public sector employments, in legislatures, we have reserved seats for SCs and STs. So we can say that in India, by liberalism, we don't mean the individual freedom. It gives power for social justice as well. And we will study about liberalism in brief in another book of political science, which is Political Theory, of this book as well. Now, another philosophy of our constitution is respect for diversity and minority rights. So respect for diversity and minority rights. As you already know that India is such a vast, diverse country. We have a lot of diversity on many different aspects. They can be religious diversity, community-based diversity, caste-based diversity, and you see race-based diversity. There can be many diverse groups depending on many factors. And if there are such social divisions, there can be two problems. First is the hierarchical problem, and second is the rivalry problem. Now, what happens that if there are so many communities, it is very natural that some communities tend to have lower opinion of other communities. They make a hierarchy where one community stands higher than other, as can be seen in caste-based discrimination. Now, in caste-based discrimination, we have seen that there is a hierarchy of communities, that is the caste communities in a religion. It means that many communities make a hierarchy where some people stand above than other. Now, another thing is that even if the communities see each other as equals, they do not make a hierarchy, they are seeing each other as equal, then there is a chance that there will be rivalry between those groups, as can be seen in religious groups, in religious communities. And we see that in India there is a form of communalism as well. Communalism leads to rivalry between the different religious communities. So either there can be hierarchy between the communities, and second, there can be rivalry between different communities. And to deal with those communities, there must be some solution in the Indian Constitution. Now, if we look at the Western solution, very easy solution would be to not recognize these communities at all. If we do not recognize communities, then there will be no kind of discrimination, will be no kind of problem. But is it really possible in India? No, it's not. Why is it so? Because India is a multicultural country. We see that in Western countries, take example of France or Germany, they do have linguistic diversity, they do have many kind of groups based on language, but compared to India, they are very low number. In India, we have a large number of different communities. Secondly, we have acknowledged the values of these communities as well, and that is why we have not adopted the policy of not recognizing these communities. One example could be that Indian Constitution gives rights to the minorities. As you know that a person can be minority on different aspect. A person may be majority in one aspect, but he or she can be minority in another aspect. So it's based on different factors. And Indian Constitution gives right to the minority, cultural and religious minority to establish their own educational institutions, and the government of India may provide aid as well. So it means that clearly we have not adopted the policy of not recognizing the communities as well. Another way of resolving the disputes between the communities is secularism. It's especially for the religious communities, for resolving the disputes, for promoting the equality between the religious communities. Now, what does secularism means? Secularism, if we go by the Western concept, it means that mutual exclusion between the state and the religion. And if we look in the Indian Constitution, though initially secularism is not mentioned in the Indian Constitution, but Indian Constitution is secular. So the different provisions written in the Constitution, Indian Constitution is considered secular. Now, what is the meaning of mutual exclusion of state and the religion? It means that there will be strict separation of the state and the religion. Religion would not interfere in the matters of state, and the state will not interfere in the matters of religion. This is kind of policy adopted in the Western countries. Now, what happens in the Western countries, that suppose there is the government, the state will not give favor to any particular religious community. Now, if it does give favor, then what will happen? That community will rise higher, and then it will tell people how to behave, how to pray, how to tell God. They will have many implications. Then that person who is being taught such things and do not wish to be so will go to the government, will go to the state. Then what will the state do? Because it is giving the favor to that particular religious community. So first thing is that religious community, the state will not give favor to any particular religion. Second is that it will not hinder that religious community as well. That too can thwart the religious freedom of the people. So in the Western concept, the state is not allowed to interfere in the matters of religion, either positively or negatively. It will not give power or will not be hindrance to a particular religious community. What is seen in the Western concept of secularism is generally the negative secularism, negative type of secularism, while in India it is the positive side of secularism is adopted, which is also known as positive secularism. In the Western societies, you will see that state and the religion are clearly separated from each other, but that is not the case in India. Why is it so? That because in Western concept, the religion is considered a private matter of an individual. It's not considered a public matter. So that's why it's private what he or she is doing in his religion. But in India, it is a different concept. Now, in Indian secularism, there are two things. First is rights of religious groups. And now you see that in Indian Constitution, in the Indian conception of secularism, there are two things that have been departed from the Western conception of secularism. First is that, of course, the Indian Constitution states the importance of intra-community equality as much as important as the individual freedom, individual equality, because it states that even if we give right to equality to the individuals, but if the communities themselves are not equal to each other, then what would happen? The members of that community which are being discriminated will not have self-dignity, will not have dignity, will not have self-respect, they will not have equality, and that's why it's important to give rights to the communities as well. So the first point of the Indian secularism is that we give right. The Indian Constitution gives right to the religious groups, especially those minority groups. One example, a very good example, is that it gives right to the religious and cultural minorities to establish their educational institutions. Second point here is state's power of intervention. Now, just I clearly stated that in Western concept, the state is not at all allowed to interfere in matters of religion, but in Indian concept, it can do so. It can enable any religious community, or it can be an hindrance to particular community. A very good example is the abolition of untouchability. Now, as you know that untouchability is a practice was a practice of a particular religion, which is clearly abolished by the Indian Constitution. So it means that the Indian Constitution interfered in the matter of a religion. So we can say that Indian Constitution has the power to intervene in a particular religion, which is clearly different from the Western conception. Now, when I say that it can either be a hindrance or it can either enable that particular religious community, so it means that it can give some favors, not some favors, some powers to particular religious community which is in minority, such as giving the right to establish their own educational institution, at the same time providing aid to those educational institutions, and can be hindrance. Some harmful practices which are against social justice or which are against the individual freedom may be abolished by the government of India. So it means that the state is clearly having the power to interfere in the religion. Religion is not considered as a private matter by the terms of the Indian Constitution. So till now we have seen three core principles of the Indian Constitution, or they can be said the achievements of the Indian Constitution. First, we have seen that our Indian Constitution reinforces and reinvents the forms of liberal individualism. This is especially important in the backdrop of a society where the community beliefs are either indifferent or hostile to the individuals. Second, we have seen that the Indian Constitution upholds the principles of social justice without compromising the rights of the individuals. A very good example is the caste-based affirmative commitment of the Constitution. How can one forget that Civil Rights Act was introduced in the US in 1964? Almost a decade after it was introduced in India. So we can say that caste-based equality for social justice was even started before it was in the US. Third is that the Indian Constitution has solution for the intercommunal strifes as well. In case of intercommunal strifes, it upholds the group rights. So we can say that the constitution makers at that time were willing to face the challenges what India would face after 5 decades, which is known as multiculturalism. So we have seen these three core principles of the Constitution. Now let us see some other achievements of the Indian Constitution as well, and together they form the philosophy of our Constitution. Next topic here is universal franchisee. I guess all of you already know that this is one of the most important basic thing that was introduced in the Indian Constitution. Universal franchise, the right to vote to every person. The Indian Constitution gives right to vote to every citizen of India, disregarding the caste, religion, sex, anything. Any person with any educational qualification from any background, financial background, political background, social background, has the right to vote. But what about the backdrop of the right to vote? How did it come in the Indian Constitution? Now, as far as this is concerned, we can see that the constitution makers, the leaders at that time in the colonial era, had a brief vision about the right to vote, about universal franchising. We can see that in two situations with having two problems, still they gave right to vote to women, to every person in India. First was when that India, being a colonial country, at that time had the vision of right to vote when most of the countries were fighting for it, were struggling for right to vote. Second, that it gave right to vote to women and working class when Western communities, Western democracies had just given them. And India, you see that women did not have to struggle that much for the right to vote, because after independence it gave immediately every person right to vote. After independence, at least women did not have to struggle for right to vote. But as we can see that from other countries, women did have to. So we can say that this provision of right to vote of universal franchisee was adopted in India. In 1895, the Constitution of India Bill also stated that any person born in India could be a public officer. could be in the government offices. And another time in 1928 in the Motilal Nehru report he gave, where it stated that every person regardless of any sex, it could be any gender, had the right to vote, could vote for their representatives. So we can say that universal franchise has always been an integral part of the Indian Constitution even before the independence. It had always been an integral revision of all those leaders. Another achievement here is Federalism. Now, as we studied about federalism in the chapter of this book, we saw that India adopts a policy of asymmetrical federalism. Unlike the symmetrical federalism of the US, where every subunit has the same power, has equal separation of powers, Indian Constitution stipulates a strong unitary government. It means that there is a unitary bias in the Indian federalism. Apart from that, asymmetrical federalism here refers that some states have been given special provisions, special privileges compared to others, and it has been stated in the Indian Constitution. It is not wrong to do so, to treat differentially some regions. Now, one of the best examples is the Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, though it has been repealed now. In the Indian Constitution, there is no Article 370 valid now, but in the book it is given there is a paragraph about the Article 370. So as you already know that Article 370 gives special provisions, special privilege to Jammu and Kashmir, which was earlier a state but now it is a union and territory. We knew that Jammu and Kashmir had its own constitution under the provisions of Article 370. Similarly, Article 371, which gives special right, which is for the northeast, for Nagaland state. In Nagaland, the Article 371 gives that pre-existing laws of Nagaland were valid, are still valid there. Secondly, the privacy of the people there is also saved, is also protected by many restrictions on immigration in Nagaland. So we can say that in Indian federalism, not all the states and union territories are treated equally. There are some differential treatment which are right according to the Indian Constitution. So we can say that there is no symmetrical federalism in India. That is one of the achievements of the Indian Constitution. Now, next thing here is, of course, with federalism comes the national identity of the people. We have already seen in the chapter of federalism that Indian Constitution stipulates a national identity. No matter what cultural identity you have, no matter what linguistic identity you have, at last you have a single citizenship, single national identity, unlike the US dual citizenship. We have seen that in the US federalism there is a dual citizenship, that is, you have a state identity as well as a national identity. But in Indian case, what you see is different. We have seen that in India a national identity is stipulated for the people. We have single citizenship, and apart from that you have your other identities as well. You have your linguistic identity, you have your cultural identity, you have your religious identity. Another idea in the national identity concept of the Indian Constitution is the rejection of the separate electorates. As you know that the demand for separate electorates was highly rejected by the Constituent Assembly, by the leaders at that time. Why is it so? Was it because it was against the notion of national identity, or was it because to prevent the discrimination or to prevent the division of the people in the country? It was not for these reasons. The rejection for the separate electorates was mostly for the reason that the leaders of the Constituent Assembly did not want to have a forced unity in the country. They wanted to have a national unity of the people's free will, of their own will, so that they would not have any kind of forced national identity imposed on themselves that would be problematic in the coming future. So through that way we can understand that by means of separate electorates we can understand that in India the concept of national identity is highly highlighted in the Indian Constitution. Now next thing here comes is procedural achievements. Now all these 5 achievements can be categorized in the substantive achievements. Another type of achievement can be procedural achievements. In procedural achievements of the Indian Constitution, 2 things come. First is the faith in the act of deliberation. We know that in the Constituent Assembly debates we can see that all the Constituent Assembly members, though they did not belong to a particular social section, they cared for it. All the members of the Constituent Assembly tried to be as inclusive as possible so that no section of the society, of the Indian society, would be left out. They wanted to include as many provisions for the social sections of the society as possible so that rights would be given to all people. So we can say that these members were not just based on self-interests, mere self-interest, but on the reasons for the society. Next in the procedural achievement would be the compromise and accommodation between the members, between the values. Now compromise is not always a negative thing. Sometimes it can be a good thing and sometimes it can be a bad thing. Compromising a big thing for mere self-interest is of course bad, but compromising a value, accommodating a value, negotiating a value partially for another value so that it would have a bigger impact on the people in a good way is good. So this kind of compromise could be in a good situation. However, there is a problem of compromising between the different conflicting rights. If there are different conflicting rights between the people, then of course there would be some problems in the compromising. So we can say that in procedural achievements there are 2 things. First is the faith of act of deliberation. Second is the idea of compromising between values and ideas. Now the next topic here comes is criticisms. We have seen all the achievements of the Indian Constitution, but what about the criticism that it received? Now talking about the criticisms of the Indian Constitution, they can be broadly categorized into 3 types. First, that it is unwieldy. Now the Indian Constitution is highly said to be unwieldy. That means that the Indian Constitution is a compact constitution. Compared to the US Constitution, even the US Constitution is not as compact as the Indian Constitution is. By saying a compact constitution, it means that in a single document, all statements, articles, laws, decisions are noted down, and somewhat it makes the Indian Constitution a large document and somewhat hard to be read out. If we compare it to other constitutions like US constitutions, they are not as compact as the Indian constitutions are. They are having different documents. Not all the statements are written in a single document called as Constitution. For example, the provisions for the Election Commission, for the Civil Services Examination are not written in the document called as Constitution in the US Constitution. So we can say that first criticism about the Indian Constitution is that it is an unwieldy constitution. Second criticism about the Indian Constitution is that it is unrepresentative. Now, as you know that the members of the Constituent Assembly were not directly elected by the people, they were indirectly elected. Second, many people criticize the Indian Constitution as the members of the Constituent Assembly were comparatively from the advanced sections of the society. So it is kind of those left out sections of the society did not have representation in the Constituent Assembly. Now to understand this, you need to understand that representation can be in 2 types. There are 2 components, major components of representation. First is voice, second is opinions. Now when we talk about voice, of course it's important. Language, voice, for any community, for any individual, it's important that his voice in his own language can be represented, and this was not done in the Constituent Assembly. But the second component of the representation, which is opinions, is highly represented in the Constituent Assembly. Though the members of this Constituent Assembly belong to advanced sections of the society, their opinions belong to all the sections of the society. Their opinions were not limited, their ideologies were not just limited to their own self-interest. They had included all the groups, all the sections of the society. So that's why we say that though the people were not from all the sections of the society, their opinions were. Third criticism about the Indian Constitution, that it is an alien document. As we saw in the chapter 1st of this book, that there are many components in the Indian Constitution which have been adopted from different constitutions of the world, from the British Constitution, from the Irish Constitution, from the American Constitution. So isn't it an alien document? Now you need to see that adopting in an innovative way, not just blindly adopting, is good for any document, and that's what had been done in India. Though India had adopted from many different constitutions, but it adapted itself. It was innovating adoption of different principles. There are two major things to be noticed about the Western borrowing of principles from Western policies, from the Western Constitution in the Indian Constitution. First is that the concept of westernization, the Western policies, Western modernity has been inculcated as a part of adaptive borrowing by the people of India. We have seen that many reformers try to use the westernization policies, westernization ideas to filth away, to deal with the filth in their own traditional values. This started from the period of Ram Mohan Roy, and it still continues to be by Dalits. They use these ideas of Western modernity to deal with the situations that are considered as filthy in their own traditional values. Second is that when these Western modernity ideas had an interaction with the local cultural beliefs, local culture, traditional values, a kind of hybrid culture developed. Now what happened was that this hybrid culture of Western modern ideas and the traditional values of India, cultural values, principles of India, made a new kind of culture which was neither in the Western modernization nor could be in the category of Indian cultural values. So we can say that a new kind of culture developed, and it's not wrong to say that India did borrow many provisions from the other constitution, but it was a kind of adapting borrowing rather than blindly borrowing it. Now, as we know that any constitution cannot be flawless, so there are some limitations on the Indian Constitution as well. There are criticisms and there are many limitations in the Indian Constitution as well. But the important point here is that these limitations are not enough to jeopardize the philosophy of our Constitution. Some of the limitations include that the idea of national unity has been a centralized idea in the Indian Constitution. Second is that some issues have been glossed over, such as the issue of gender justice. We know that in India is still a patriarchal society, so we can say that some issues have been glossed over in the Indian Constitution. Third point is that some socio-economic rights that should have been in the fundamental rights are in the category of directive principles of state policy, which makes it not legally enforceable. So we can say that there are some limitations to the Indian Constitution, but still they can be counteracts and they are not enough to jeopardize the philosophy of our Constitution. Now lastly, after studying all this, what have we concluded from this chapter? So the conclusion of this chapter. Now you need to understand about one thing about Constitution, that any society any country needs to be governed by a document which reflects the ideas, the philosophy of the citizens of that country, and that vision has been stipulated in our constitution. That philosophy of the people has been inculcated in that constitution. And where did this vision come from? This vision is a commonly agreed vision, and it started through the national movements, through the freedom struggles, through the independence struggles, through the colonial era. After that, we have seen that the Constituent Assembly acts as a platform where this vision is refined, modified, and presented in a legal structure. And that's why we say that for any country, legal provisions and institutional arrangements should be in a commonly agreed vision. And that's what the Constitution is. Constitution defines the legal provisions for our country. The Constitution provides the institutional arrangements, and these are on a commonly agreed vision that started from a long time ago. Another thing is that to describe the philosophy of the Indian Constitution, the best way is the preamble of our Constitution. If we read the preamble of the Constitution, you will see that it's not written that the Constitution is given by us. It's written that we, the people of India, have adopted and prepared the Constitution. It means that the people of India, we are the makers of our own destiny if we look at the legal provisions, because all the people's voices, representations, all the sections of the society have the representation in the Constitution of India. So we can say that we prepared and adopted our own Constitution through our ideas, values, and ideologies. Though there are still many shortcomings in the politics of India, no doubt there are many criticism, limitations, there are many problems with the politics of India that we will study in the next class as well. But still, when we ask the political leaders, when we ask the citizens of India, what they say is that we want to live together and we want to prosper together. It means that the coming of the Indian Constitution was a blessing in disguise itself. So that's, we can say that in 1950, when it was adopted on 26 January, it was still a good thing. So that's all we have covered in this chapter. And with this chapter, this book of political science of class 11th, Indian Constitution at Work, has been completed. Next book is left, that is political theory, which I will cover in soon in the upcoming videos as well. So stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you very much.